Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Lisa Watson, president of the City Club of Portland. For over 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you joining us through KGW's website, Facebook feed, or news app, X-Ray FM, or on Open Signal's community media television stations. The generous support of City Club's media partners and corporate sponsors enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to recognize City Club's fall sponsors, Avangrid Renewables and Morel Inc., as well as event sponsor, First Interstate Bank. The term fake news has picked up steam in 2017, but attacks on the credibility of media institutions are not new. In fact, public trust in national media outlets has been on the decline since the 70s. In 2017, media organizations face an unusually contentious political landscape, sharp pressures on their business models, and global social media networks that many believe have lowered our collective capacity to vet credible information. In short, the terrain of news media's future is rocky. Luckily, we're joined today by three experts here to help us navigate this post-fact world. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Israel Bayer, who's Executive Director of Street Roots, a weekly newspaper produced with and sold by people experiencing homelessness and poverty. Israel has worked in the street newspaper movement for more than a decade. He's a journalist, poet, photographer, and painter. Joining him today is Kimberly Wilson, the Director of Communications at Meyer Memorial Trust. Kimberly stumbled into journalism, first covering President Bill Clinton's early morning White House jogs. She went on to work as a reporter and investigative journalist at the Oregonian, the Baltimore Sun, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and the Associated Press. Our moderator today is Ben DeJarnett, a project and product manager at the University of Oregon's Agora Journalism Center, and co-author of the new book, Reimagining Journalism in a Post-Truth World, How Late-Night Comedians, Internet Trolls, and Savvy Reporters Are Transforming News. Ben is a freelance journalist and holds a master's in media studies from the University of Oregon. Please welcome all of our speakers.
Thanks, Lisa. I'd like to frame the conversation today by sharing a few numbers from my book with Ed that I think highlight the scale of the challenge facing journalists. So in 1976, shortly after journalism's Watergate triumph, 72% of Americans told Gallup that they had a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in the news media. During the 1990s, when Fox News, MSNBC, the rise of kind of partisan cable media unfolded, we saw that number drop below 55%. And then in 2016, during the campaign, only 32% of Americans, including 14% of Republicans, said that they had confidence in the news media. So a lot of attention is paid to the president's rhetoric, the tweets, the attacks by politicians against the credibility of the news media. But this really is an issue of trust that's been going on for a long time. Kimberly, I'll start with you. You're someone who's seen this happening both within a newsroom as a reporter and now from your vantage with Meyer Memorial Trust. So what do you see as the biggest structural force that's driving this erosion of public trust other than kind of the current political climate?
I think you nailed it in describing that sort of precipitous drop over the last 40 years. When you have available to consume news, and news that is entertainment, and entertainment that is news, it makes it very hard for the consumer of news, for the reader of news, the person who wants to stay informed, to know what actually is legitimate, what's true, and it makes it easy over time to really shift the balance from news being what you're consuming to having a diet that is largely infotainment, is largely opinion, is largely emotion, and is devoid of the kind of information that you actually need to stay informed. And I think that's where we are today.
Israel, same question to you. How would you kind of explain how we got to this point?
Well, I think it's important to put into context that the consumers of media throughout the years have always been skeptical of media. When you look back at the history of our nation, Prior to the American Civil War, you had hundreds of editorial boards that were supporting slavery, while hundreds of other editorial boards were supporting the abolitionist movement. You can say the same of the Jim Crow era, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, weapons of mass destruction, et cetera, et cetera. So, depending on the context of the subject matter at hand, I think that the American public has always been skeptical of the media. What's changed in that context is there's just so much more noise today. There's so much more happening. There's so much more access to news. We have the ability to be to report the news ourselves through social media, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of, when people say that the good old days of journalism are gone, I would have to really challenge that, understanding that oftentimes the media perpetuated a lot of the very things that today we look back in history and think were horrible policy or events that were going down. So I do think we're in a different environment, but the idea that America ever truly trusted the media is up for debate.
I'm glad you mentioned the rise of social media and the noise that comes along with that. It seems impossible to have this conversation without kind of leading with Facebook and Google and the impact that social media has had. So just last month, Mark Zuckerberg described Facebook's goal as being to give all people a voice and create a platform for all ideas. So it's kind of a utopian vision that he's been sticking by through thick and thin. But the question I posed to both of you is it compatible, do you think, to have kind of a healthy fact-based news ecosystem at the same time? Can that exist alongside of a truly free and open internet? Or should we be talking more about having Facebook and Google play the gatekeeping role that was once played by journalists?
So what I'd like is to set some ground rules on the language we're using. Media is everything. Media is the DVD that's in your DVD player. It's the GIF that you sent your friend in a text an hour ago. It's the entire ecosphere. And news is, in the Venn diagram with media, is a smaller circle. And everything that is media is not news. And social media is wonderful. I mean, there are so many wonderful things that social media lets us do, but it's not news. And it's not the editorial choices, let's say, of a Facebook, are not the editorial choices that a responsible newsroom is going to make. They're not going to push forward a story whose source is untrustworthy. That's not how newsrooms generally work. So I think understanding that there's a difference between the media writ large and the news that we're consuming, there can be a bright line in how we consume our news. And we can use our Facebook to stay in touch with our third grade teacher and find out who just had a baby and like it and send them the smile. And then we can be more thoughtful and more critical around the actual news we consume and not give the click to the gossip or not give the click to the news source that is not actually reputable and is going to take advantage of your vulnerability when you click it and tell you something that you might take at face value, but actually isn't worth your time.
What role do you think that that puts a lot of the onus on the consumer to be responsible about what they're consuming and what they're sharing? What responsibility do you think the platforms have? Google, Facebook, Twitter, they have all kinds of decisions written into their algorithms about what we see and how likely we are to click on it. And so far, they've been very resistant to kind of accept any responsibility as news publishers. They'd rather see themselves as tech companies outside of the rules that govern journalists. Do you think we need to be pressuring them to step more into the role of a publisher, as we have kind of traditionally understood that?
I would answer and say that we haven't pushed our publishers to give us what we want. So, sure, take on Facebook, but also take on your local news media. And if you're not getting the coverage for the things that matter to you, if you don't know what your school board is doing, or if you don't feel that there's adequate coverage of a water issue in your community. Like that's where you push back to get the news that you want and support the news that you want. I think that would apply to both social media and to existing mainline news organizations.
Yeah, and I think it calls into question the idea of social media in relationship to news in a way that it poses the question of should the very platforms that historically, so if you're a consumer of news, historically you would go to that specific site. The vast majority of online traffic for Street Roots comes through Twitter and Facebook and social media. So you're actually consuming Street Roots news on the Facebook platform. And so that creates, we're all, we create our own ability to look at what news we want. And so I think it raises a lot of questions around the idea of should social media have a regulatory factor in the context of news, and I think we're simply in uncharted territory. I do believe that social media platforms do have a responsibility to be able to look at this issue in a very intentional way and to scale up to be able to look at the problems and solve the problems, because it can have a very negative impact and do the very thing that the founder of Facebook, he wants to see Facebook as a tool to be able to give voice, but it could actually create an adverse effect on that very thing. So I think the short answer is I think we're in uncharted territory and we don't actually know. And as things play out in the world that we are in today, I think that it's going to raise a lot more questions.
As a news publisher, how do you view your relationship with Facebook? Because it seems on the one hand, it's your best tool perhaps for reaching an audience and a community, but at the same time, you don't control the relationship or the connection necessarily with that community. You're sort of at the mercy of this third-party platform. So can you talk through that challenge and how you view it?
Well, I think that we've embraced it. I don't think we have a choice. I think the idea of being able to be storytellers and to provide news in our community, understanding that the vast majority of consumers, not only in our community but in our country and around the world, are accessing social media to gain access to news. We've embraced it, but we are oftentimes put in a situation where we're playing guessing games in the context of how we provide context for publishing the content that we're using on social media. We have no control. We can curate the message, but outside of that, we have no control over how that message is then seen for the broader audience. I think for many small nonprofits or news organizations or anybody that has a organizational Facebook page, we have 10,000 followers at Street Roots, but we put up a post and maybe only 1,000 of those people will actually access the news. So we're really, we have and there's nobody to call at Facebook to ask how we solve that problem. So those are things that we have to embrace, but we do it begrudgingly because that's just the reality that we're in.
It seems like the question that goes in hand with social media and the fact that news consumers are increasingly getting their access to news content through platforms like Facebook is the business model, revenue model question. Because the reason we saw so much fake news, sensationalized news, clickbait headlines in 2016, but really before that, is in large part because it makes money. It generates eyeballs for advertisers, and that's what kind of makes the system run. So what role does those market incentives play in either in contributing to this problem or making the problem worse?
Well, I would push back. I hate the word fake news because really what we're talking about is propaganda. And so to have fake and news together as a term, I would challenge people to really think about the language that they're using and they're actually taking. It becomes one of those message tools that then diverts from what we're actually talking about. Russia or anybody. The CIA was just discovered in putting out news throughout the Middle East around X, Y, and Z. Russia is doing it in the United States. That is propaganda. That is not news, that is not fake news, it is simply propaganda. So I think we have to change the dialogue around what we're actually talking about, because it's created this environment in which now all news is called into question of whether it's real or not. And ultimately, we know that news is fact-based, objective to the best of our ability to be able to deliver a story or a problem or a policy or whatever we're putting out into the community. And none of the stuff that we're talking about has anything to do with news. It has to do with controlling an environment that has major consequences that we're seeing play out in our community and in our society.
And I absolutely agree with Israel on that. It also has an impact. That propaganda is intended to make you believe something that isn't true, or believe a perspective on realities around you and change your mind, or pull you over to a place that doesn't believe blue is blue. And it's really dangerous. And so it makes it even more of an incentive, I think, to take ownership of what you consume and what you call news, what you actually introduce into your world as news, because you're being influenced by these untruths and this propaganda, and eventually you can start to believe it. Because if that's what you're consuming, there's nothing to tell you that it isn't true. It looks like news, it sounds like news. If it's on a screen, I'm sure the people behind the desk, are just as suited up as the person behind the desk that is an actual news program. So being thoughtful about what you choose to introduce into your sphere, into your eyes, into your ears, really matters.
And aside on the language question, I think fake news really was first used to talk about Jon Stewart and kind of the faux news artists on Comedy Central, and then it was fake news as Russian propaganda, and now it's been this term co-opted by politicians for anything that makes them look bad. So I think you're right to really try and move away from that language. If you're just joining us on the radio, I'm talking with Kimberly Wilson of Meyer Memorial Trust and Israel Bayer of Street Roots about news media in a post-fact world. And I'd like to pivot now from the problems facing journalists universally and more towards the challenges facing journalists closer to home here in Oregon day to day. So just last month, my colleague Damian Radcliffe and the Agora Journalism Center released a new report titled Local Journalism in the Pacific Northwest, Why It Matters, How It's Evolving, and Who Pays for It. I think we could probably spend a whole afternoon tackling any one of those questions. But I wanted to start by highlighting a quote from in the report from Caitlin May at the Cottage Grove Sentinel. She said, quote, "I think local media has an important role to play in building the overall reputation of and belief in journalism. Engagement plays a big part in this, in that it gives people a one-on-one relationship with journalism." So Israel, as someone who's dealing with these challenges day to day, what do you think journalists need to do to build relationships with and earn trust from the people they're serving?
Well, I think you have to be able to look at the landscape that you're in and the issues at hand and be able to build real relationships in the community to be able to deliver stories of the people and the policies that affect our community. I think that oftentimes locally what we end up doing is following and chasing the same stories, and so these things become homelessness, for example. Every news outlet currently in the city has a homeless beat reporter, and oddly enough, Street Roots has moved away from covering homelessness on a week-to-week basis because we don't want to be able to duplicate the same story generated just through maybe a different quote or a different lens. And so I think it's important for us as the media to work together to be able to understand the larger landscape that we're in, so we're able, with less resources, to cover more ground. I believe it's a newspaper's responsibility to be able to take problems that exist on the horizon, solutions that exist on the horizon, and drive your readers towards a pathway to be able to solve the problems that we face in our community, and not just get caught up in the day-to-day clickbait that ends up happening that creates an environment where we're really not getting the information that we need to be able to change and affect the landscape that we're in.
For folks who aren't familiar with Street Roots, can you kind of explain the editorial approach and how the way that you would cover an issue like housing or homelessness would differ from, say, the Oregonian?
Well, I think instead of just doing spot news on a specific subject, that our managing editor, Joanne Zuhl, and the news team tries to put any issue that we're publishing into context. You have to be able to deliver the nuances around a specific subject so that you're not just understanding homelessness as we see it literally today, but you're putting into context how we got here, the issues surrounding it, so that the reader understands that this is not just something that happened yesterday, this is not a crisis that hasn't been solved before, that you have nuances around that. And so I think our editorial team at Street Roots also does a very good job at being able to understand the human experience in a way that we're able to relate to the stories that we're reporting. And so oftentimes you can't have a reporter parachute into a specific issue area and not know anything about it and expect them to relate to the very sources that they're reporting on. So I think that, context, adding the nuances, delivering a broader landscape on any specific issue is critical to being able to understand an issue in a way that you're able to have a positive effect on it.
Can I piggyback on that and your earlier question about business models? Street Roots is a nonprofit newspaper. So, correct me if I'm wrong, Israel, that means there's not an owner of the newspaper who lives in a community far from here who's dictating what they cover or what's going to be on the front page. It's a local newspaper, and it's not driven by, or what you cover is not driven by an economic model that says this is going to sell more papers versus this other topic. Am I right?
That's correct.
Okay. So newspapers that you might pick up in a box in town that are not nonprofit newspapers are guided by different structures and different ideas. And effectively, that means that, and the cost to produce that kind of paper is really expensive. So if you're from a generation where you're used to having a paper land on your front step or go to a box and put a quarter in and get a paper out, then you might have thought when you did that you were paying for that newspaper. And what would be kind of shocking to discover if you were a young reporter taking a tour of the plant where your newspaper is produced would be to discover that, in fact, that quarter didn't pay for the cost of that paper at all. What paid for the cost of that paper was advertising. So when advertising was big and before the market crashed, before the advertising market kind of started to crash, there were huge returns that newspaper owners were able to generate. You could just pay a quarter and get your paper, and you got newsrooms filled with maybe hundreds of people covering every aspect or almost every aspect of your community. And in a world where newspapers have, particularly newspapers, subscription numbers have declined from 450,000 in the late 1990s to about 350,000 in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, to, at least locally here, Sunday circulation, to about 170,000 in circulation. It's a lot fewer quarters or dollars coming in, and advertising comes in a different format, and it comes in digital clicks, and those clicks are the comments at the bottom that you hate to read, particularly if you're a reporter, where one person is nagging another person and they're fighting. In the comments, each time one of those people clicks send at the bottom of their nasty message, it's not the news story, it's not the news, but it actually is a profitable experience for the newspaper owners. So there's a different experience in consuming nonprofit news and supporting nonprofit news. There's a new platform that was recently unveiled last week that allows regular, ordinary citizens to go to one place to be able to access all the nonprofit, investigative, and daily news, or weekly news coverage in the country. And if you want to support that kind of journalism, you can, and you can do it in a really easy way, so that you have a sense of ownership of the content that you actually want.
Israel, what you mentioned kind of the importance of not parachuting into an issue and covering something that you don't have this broader context and understanding of. You know, how does your staff and your reporters develop that knowledge so that when you're covering an issue that you know that you're doing it justice and sharing the perspectives that need to be included in the conversation?
Well, I think that you create an environment where you allow reporters and editors to actually have the space and time to develop stories and to really immerse themselves in a specific topic, and you're able to drive over time to really understand the issue in a very intentional way. Obviously, we have a very small team, so I like to say that we're a small train that carries a heavy load in the community, because our editorial team at Street Roots is very professional and phenomenal in the work that they're able to do. But I think that, you know, you can't, we pick specific issue areas, of course, that range across different issues, but we don't go outside of the box in a way where we're covering things that we don't understand. So oftentimes what's happening in newsrooms today is you have a reporter that's responsible for transportation and housing and immigration, and so they're never able to actually stop and understand the issue in the broader context. So they're constantly behind in trying to understand what they're reporting, and so you know, I think it's being intentional about the work that you're producing in a way that you can pack the most bang for your buck.
You mentioned two words, space and time, that I think a lot of journalists feel like they don't have anymore, and it kind of comes back, I think, to the business model question that we were chatting about this earlier, that, you know, as the traditional business model has been disrupted, a lot of news organizations have decided to try and maintain profits by cutting on the cost side as opposed to finding other revenue sources. And now as a result of that, I think you see reporters at legacy institutions being asked to do more than ever to write more content, get it up faster, tweet more, interact in the comments section, all this other stuff. And I think what often gets left out is the simpler part of walking the beat and knowing the community and having the time and space, as you said, to really just have conversations with people and ask questions and learn an issue. Kimberly, was that your experience in your time in journalism, that there was kind of that ever-increasing ask of the day-to-day journalist?
Sure. And I would say earlier in my career, there was more of that opportunity, more of that time for me to do that kind of deeper dive. And later in my career, I would say that, yeah, the demands to maintain a connection, not through the reporting, not through the coverage, the work of making sources and showing up at meetings to hear what people in communities, let's say, were saying, but more that digital connection, that became really important. You know, a clever, snarky headline and funny way of telling a weather story was considered a worthwhile pursuit of my time. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's not the same thing as a beat reporter or putting primacy on really getting the storytelling right and being journalists.
And I think that, you know, the fabric and the landscape has changed so much. And, you know, I personally don't have a high school education. I came up off the block with the help of mentors and many people around me. I was able to land on the journey that I'm on. And so often I think that what makes a good journalist is instinct, and sometimes you either have it or you don't. Oftentimes people from environments that grow up in poverty, that are a part of a larger community, that we're covering this political divide between rural America and urban America, or people of color, or the LGBTQ community, or whatever it may be. Those individuals can make phenomenal journalists, but there's not a pathway oftentimes for them to be able to be covering the communities that they understand at a very deep level. And so, the way it is now is if you are lucky enough to go to journalism school, you're scrambling for 5-6 years before you maybe get a shot at a newsroom, because our newsrooms are shrinking. So what that's ended up doing is creating a gap where only privileged people can survive in their 20s to even potentially get a job at the Oregonian. And you have to almost have a safety net. But if you come from poverty, if you have kids, whatever, our best journalists are basically turning to other trades because they can't survive in the field. And so it creates a disconnect between what's happening in our world and how reporters can cover things on the ground. I think Puerto Rico and what's happening right now is a perfect example of all of that's being covered from the Beltway, but I unless I go on Twitter and actually read from people affected by the hurricane in Puerto Rico, I don't know what's going on the ground. So that's the lack of resources, that's a lack of experienced journalists on the ground. It's a combination of many things, and so we've got a real divide in that area.
And it's not just a crisis like Hurricane Maria. I don't know if you remember, but after this recent election, there was a lot of hand-wringing about rural and Appalachian. We hadn't listened to people in coal mining country. And I listened to that conversation, and I was thinking, actually, it's not that people didn't listen to people in coal mining country, but those people probably aren't very well represented in newsrooms. And if they're not represented in newsrooms, and if people in color aren't represented in newsrooms, or if people from the LGBTQ community aren't represented in newsrooms, how well can you expect somebody else to tell your story, or to take your story and make it a priority? I think that was a good example where it showed that it doesn't become somebody else's priority. So newsrooms do need to reflect the communities that we serve, but also everyone that's here, whether they're immigrants, whomever they are, so that you're not just telling your own story or the stories that matter to you, you're telling the stories that matter to people who don't look like you.
I'm glad that representation issue came up, because it seems like that's a nut that the journalism industry's been trying to crack for decades now with very little success. I mean, every year, I think we see the updated kind of newsroom diversity surveys, and it's still older, whiter, more male than the American public. So how do you think about trying to start to solve that problem and remove some of those structural barriers that you were talking about, Israel, where as an industry, if you want to make it 5 years out of journalism school, you have to have that privileged background?
Well, I think newspapers and media institutions have to do a deep dive into the very equity work that we're talking about as a reflection in our community around race, around institutionalized racism, around a whole variety of things that have created this structural barrier to leave people out of conversation. So it's not that journalism or newsrooms can't figure out how to hire people of color. It's that they are not prioritizing within their own institutions of creating the ability to make room for other people. So it's not that there's a shortage of talent in any one area of our society. It's a matter of you have an institutionalized segment of our population that are dinosaurs in an age of corporate America that have not made the cultural shift to a place where we need to be equitable in our community. And that's something I think newsrooms have to turn around and look in the mirror on.
And I would say newsrooms have gotten it right before. Those numbers have gone down. again. And the important lesson maybe to newsrooms would be to not stop things that work. But when newsrooms are shrinking, they're much smaller than they used to be. So maybe in the rush to save money and reduce staff, there hasn't been much priority placed on ensuring that the staff that you have continue to be a diverse, inclusive representation of your community.
That seems to loop back to that question of trust in a post-fact world, or really any world that if your newsroom doesn't reflect your community, it's hard to ask people who don't see themselves reflected in your journalism or in your newsroom to trust the work you're doing. I remember being in a conference this spring where we were talking about the same issue, trust in the media, and again, I think falling into the bad habit of talking about it as a 2016 problem rather than this longer term problem. And someone in the room stood up and said, look, in minority communities, we haven't trusted the mainstream media ever because we've never seen ourselves and our experiences and our truths reflected in your work. I mean, do you think that's as big a problem as any, that perhaps the conversation is too focused on the political status quo and the latest developments and not these rather big systemic challenges around representation?
I'll answer it this way. I have a former colleague and somebody who used to work at the Oregonian who this week, her name is Nicole Hannah-Jones. This week she was named a MacArthur Genius Grant awardee. It's a huge deal and a huge honor and a recognition of her really excellent reporting. She's a reporter who was really ever interested in two things. She was interested in race, and she was interested in the intersection between race and education and race and housing policy. And she's really well versed and a huge student of both of those areas. And she was able to bring, by virtue of her interest and by virtue of her abilities, she's been able to go from the Oregonian to ProPublica, which is another nonprofit organization, fantastic nonprofit investigative news organization, to the New York Times Magazine, and she's going to be writing a book soon as well. She's able to have a much bigger platform and tell stories that really matter. And I think ensuring that newsrooms respect and reflect the breadth of the stories that need to be told will go a long way to improving people's trust in those institutions. Reading her stories, I trust what she's saying. I learn things from what she's reporting, and I wouldn't know them, however, if she wasn't in a newsroom. Nobody else has written what she's written. It's why she's getting a Genius Grant. That's something we should think about.
I love that you bring that up. I was chatting with a reporter from KPCC just last week, and she said that one of her community members has become a super fan of KPCC, but that his journey started by scanning the website for Asian bylines. He was an Asian man, and that was his way in to reading. And I'd never kind of heard it articulated quite that explicitly, that journey would start there. I think we have a couple minutes left before we take questions. There's one more thing from Damian Radcliffe's report last month that I wanted to highlight. One of his conclusions is that doubling down on local content may be essential for survival of local news. And he said, quote, "When considering the future prospects of the sector, scarcity matters. Because audience have access to more information than ever, local media outlets need to offer something different in terms of content, perspective, and applied journalism values." So where do each of you see opportunities for local news outlets here in Portland to provide that unique value and to do something, to provide people with something that they can't get anywhere else?
Well, I think being able to provide original content is critical, and that could be at a very hyper-local level or it could be at a statewide level, but I think we are so glazed over around certain stories that it's hard to even get past the headlines. So for a long time, always went to CNN as a web-based news outlet that I would gather my news to kind of be right there in the middle. I don't think I've gone on CNN in the past 3 or 4 months without it basically re-reporting Trump tweets, and that's a trusted news outlet. And I have gotten to the point where it doesn't matter what specifically Trump is saying. I know that that's what they're going to lead with, and it's turned me away from their news platform. And so that doesn't mean I don't want to understand the larger context, but I think it's really important that we provide original content in our community, that people can have a broad breadth of understanding what's going on across all spectrums of where we live. And so I think that that's very important, original content, and we can turn on any news outlet at any time and get the same story told in 12 different versions. So I think that we have to be seeking out original content all the way.
I would just agree. In journalism, in newsrooms, there's always a number of TVs going, and they all have the cable news, all-day news going behind you. And leaving journalism for the life of Foundation Communications, that's maybe been my favorite shift. I don't consume that anymore. It's not the soundtrack of my life, and I don't go home and watch it. And so not consuming it means, even in an era when every day there's reasons to be stressed about what's going on in the world, I'm not as stressed as the person next to me who's consuming from the moment they wake up until the moment they go to bed, opinion and urgency and splash screens and of what isn't actually news.
Want to finish on a bright note before we go to questions from the crowd. So what makes you optimistic or excited about what's happening in Portland's media environment?
I would say Israel and his paper make me very excited. We're really fortunate to have a nonprofit weekly newspaper in town that is excellent at what they do, and so good at it that they forced other news organizations to now do that as well, and now they've moved on to other areas. So I think that's something to be hopeful about.
Yeah, I think that with the platforms that we have, journalism is alive and well in our community, storytelling is alive and well in our community, and we all have the ability to inform the news, be a part of the news. So I think that there are a lot of hopeful opportunities. It's not as if we don't have access to information. It's just trying to dig down and find that information that we know is trusted and real. I feel like in Portland we have a wealth of different media outlets. We have a civic engaged community that reads the news. So I feel like we're pretty lucky in Portland to be able to just be talking about the things that we're talking about and not completely ignoring many of the social issues that are very important to our community. So I think that in Portland, I think that we have a lot to be thankful for with our media the way that it is, and that there's lots of great things to come, I believe.
Great. I think we're ready to pivot to audience questions. So if you have a note card, hold it high in the air. You can also participate on Twitter, ask your question along with the hashtag #FridayForum. City Club members, we invite you to ask your questions to the microphone. So asking questions at the Friday Forum mic is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. And if you do speak the mic, please identify yourself as a City Club member and try and ask a question in under 30 seconds.
City Club member. Israel, I wondered if you had someone put a tracker on my car, because wherever I go, there's a Street Roots guy offering me a paper, and I'm in deeper with you than I am with the New York Times on a monthly basis.
Yes, the thing that makes Street Roots special is the social entrepreneurial aspect. We take the newspaper very seriously and what we're providing, but we also are able to give individuals experiencing homelessness and poverty and income, which is great. I would also argue that it's not a perfected distribution model. Obviously, it's built on the idea that there's poverty in our community, and it's not something as if that we think that it's a new model that can generate great things in the context of distribution. It's something that we're working hard every single day to give people a safe place to call home. And so it's a product of a broken social system that allows us to do what we do. And you know, our margin of error at Street Roots is very little. When people say, oh, Street Roots has figured it out, I like to remind them that we're only one grant or one donation away from having to downsize our newsroom itself too. So it's a hard environment out there.
Mike, I made a comment. My question was going to be about news foundations. I noticed that the Guardian, you know, asked me for donations to their organization. I often wondered why the Oregonian didn't set up a news foundation for people that are, you know, still want a tactile piece of paper in the morning to read. So I wanted your opinion on news foundations.
They're wonderful, but they're really for nonprofit journalism. And so for-profit news organizations like the Oregonian, they're not a charity, and they don't run themselves with you as their stakeholder in mind.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to push the foundation world itself to understand that journalism is a key component of our society in a way that foundations are funding social justice causes, communication teams, direct service, but journalism has to be a part of that mix. I'll also note that I believe the Willamette Week has an investigative journalism fund. And so I think that there's two ways to give. You can give to Street Roots, and I suppose I'm giving the Willamette Week a plug. So,
Nick Orphanakis, a City Club member. You brought up several interesting points, but one that I didn't hear was a little bit more about the fact-checking. Okay, I'll talk to the mic. Expand a little bit more on the fact-checking component of journalism. And if journalism is so important to our democracy, don't we need to have a more formal process in determining if a newspaper is doing its job? We can say the capitalist model is failing and it's killing the capitalist newspaper, but we don't have anything out there. I have to trust that you are talking to several worthy people in getting your information. The Brits have set up an independent commission which is sort of empowered to evaluate fact-checking and that sort of information. Isn't it time that we get over to that kind of a process and even expand it to the point of saying, you're not doing your job as a newspaper for our community, our country. Maybe your business license needs to be evaluated in the Trumpian way. Thank you.
So I love the idea of a kind of clearinghouse for checking whether an organization is telling the truth, if their news is legit. The only question that I would sort of ask back is, again, we're consuming news from so many platforms. So I'm talking about newspapers because that's the world I come from. But there are online news organizations. There are online news organizations that come from a political or a position, a thought position, and that's what directs what they cover and what they say. There are individuals who have a Facebook account or a Twitter account who are citizens journalists, and they write and say what they believe. I like the idea of being able to know whether what you're consuming is credible. And I think right now, and probably for a while, it's going to fall to us to be that. Not to check the facts, but to check our sources. And there's great journalism happening in Oregon, not just at Street Roots. Oregonian has fantastic reporters. sure, even good reporters make mistakes, but there are reporters that you can trust, that you can read their stories, every one of their stories, and you're going to be informed, and you can trust what they're saying. There just isn't a mechanism to cover everything that's out there, so it ends up, the onus falls on us to be the kind of consumers that are skeptical, unless they know otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways that professional journalists can distinguish themselves from the rest of the content that floats around social media, is that that they do have a discipline of verification, accuracy, fact-checking. And I think that the stakes of that become even higher when you have an administration that uses that, quote, fake news label as a bludgeon for anything they disagree with. I mean, you really have to make sure as a professional journalist that you're not giving them any real ammunition to use and proving their point by making a sloppy mistake, and fact-checking and verification and helping people make sense of what they're reading is a huge part of that. I want to jump in quickly with a question from a radio listener. It's a quick one. When the president tweets, does it matter?
Absolutely. We live in a democracy, and our president is a big factor in guiding what happens to this country. So whoever the president is, when they make official statements and the government has declared that his tweets are official statements, it is news.
Yeah, I would say so too. I think that it was, I believe Sam Adams, when Sam Adams was mayor, he took an hour out of every week and just interfaced with people on Twitter. Twitter, like anything else, is a communication tool that's used to deliver official statements or communication between the masses. So, social media is a platform to be able to deliver a conversation between elected officials and the broader public.
Yeah, let's take another question from the mic.
Yes. Mike Ponder, City Club member. I was interested in your comments about who ends up being in the newsroom and issues related to admission, recruitment, financial support for students. But what would you suggest that journalism schools now need to do to better prepare these young people, or new reporters, if you will, to do a job in this ever-changing news world, and especially with the nonprofits?
How long do we have?
Oh my.
This is something that we've thought about a lot at Street Roots. I mean, I think that there needs to be, we often, obviously being able to create the opportunity for scholarships for people that don't have the financial ability to attend J School, I think is critical in being able to set up endowments, funds for all kinds of people to be able to attend and have the richness of that experience. I also think there has to be a runway out of J School. So I think that being able to set up a fellowship or an endowment with local nonprofit organizations where people have a running start at being able to really get their legs underneath them. And so if any of you out there want to create an endowment at Street Roots for a reporter to come and take on a 2-year fellowship post J School, we're all ears. I think that those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to do to be able to work hand in hand with both universities and our media institutions to be able to fill that gap. Outside of subsidizing resources, I don't see how it can be filled. So.
And I would say hiring. I mean, not everybody who comes into journalism comes through a J School program. You've got people who go to community college, you've got people who study English, literature, you've got people from all kind of backgrounds, and there needs to be doorways into journalism for all of them.
Yes, next question.
Carol Witherell, what would happen if schools that teach, and hopefully all schools are teaching government and civics, asked their students to do research that both did hard analysis and models that are working in the community or around the world? And what if our journalists, also news sources of all stripes, would balance 50% news that's of great concern and hard analysis with models that work, solutions? I've been looking for magazines like that, and Yes Magazine is the one that comes the closest, involving both youth and adults.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of writing for Yes Magazine on one occasion, and solution stories are my favorite to read and to write. And they're often, I think, the most popular stories that I do write, because we are kind of beat over the head every day through all platforms with bad news and news that leaves us feeling disempowered. And so to have stories that point the way for actions we can take or ways we can actually make a difference, I think is really valuable. The Solutions Journalism Network is a great nonprofit that's really trying to advance that work and provide some funding for freelancers to do that kind of storytelling, as well as getting into schools and partnering with professors to really teach that approach to students. And Brent Walth, former Willamette Week editor, who's now a professor at the University of Oregon, has become a champion of solutions journalism in the last couple years, and I think actually might be hosting a workshop on it this week.
And he used to work at the Oregonian. So.
Yeah.
Kurt Wavering, member. We're in the unusual situation of having a president using Twitter, at 4 in the morning without any vetting previously. And obviously, as you've said, if the president says it, it's news and you have to report it. But it's disturbing to see that kind of unvetted pronouncements from a president. Now, the New York Times has been very assiduous to do fact-checking and to report that. And is that kind of thing a model for other major newspapers?
So I'm so happy you asked that question because I think, I'm outside of a newsroom right now, but the biggest challenge that I think I hear my former colleagues describe in journalism that faces them in this era is the idea that there weren't tools to allow a journalist, when a person in authority said something that was completely untrue and easy to prove untrue. There were no mechanisms available as a journalist to sort of call out in real time, this is not true, or this person is leading you astray, this is actually not fact. There was no history of breaking through the fourth wall as a journalist, still being objective, but also being able to sort of call crazy what it is, or call a lie what it is. And there is now, the New York Times has along with Washington Post, they're treading in new territory in having serious, solid journalists with impeccable reputations also, without editorializing, tell the reader when something is or is not true right there in real time. But it didn't exist as a practice because it hadn't been as important as it is today.
We are out of broadcast time and we'll have to stop for the day. If this program's inspired you to join or contribute to City Club, you can do so at the registration table at the back of the room. This is Lisa Watson from City Club's Board of Governors. Thank you to our guests, Kimberly, Israel, and Ben, and special thanks to Colin Jones and the Friday Forum Committee for their hard work. We are adjourned.